22 years on death row for a murder he didn't commit. Nick Yarris came within hours of execution multiple times but never stopped fighting for justice. When DNA finally proved his innocence, he had lost over 2 decades of his life. This is the most heartbreaking, wrongful conviction story ever told. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible prisoner justice stories. Nick Yarris, born 1961 in Philadelphia. Petty criminal with no history of violence, wrongfully convicted at 20 for murder and sentenced to death. Spent 22 years on death row maintaining his innocence until DNA proved him right. Mae Craig, 32 years old, secretary and devoted mother of 2 children. Murdered in December 1981 after her office Christmas party. Her brutal death sparked the investigation that wrongfully convicted Nick Yarris. Detective Martin Devlin, lead investigator on the Craig murder case, under enormous public pressure to solve the high-profile case quickly. His tunnel vision investigation led to Nick's wrongful conviction. Barry Scheck, pioneering DNA lawyer and co-founder of the Innocence Project, took on Nick's case in the 1990s and fought for years to get DNA testing that would prove his innocence. 22 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. Nick Yarris spent over 2 decades waiting to die for someone else's murder. When DNA finally proved his innocence, the world had changed completely, and so had he. December 15th, 1981. The snow fell heavily across Pennsylvania, blanketing the suburbs of Delaware County in a deceptive layer of purity that masked the darkness beneath. Mae Craig, a 32-year-old secretary and mother of 2, was driving home from her office Christmas party when her life intersected with evil in the parking lot of a shopping center. Linda never made it home that night. Her car was found abandoned, keys still in the ignition, purse scattered across the front seat. 3 days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area 15 miles away. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered with a brutality that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. The case immediately became front-page news across the Delaware Valley. Linda Craig was a beloved member of her community, a devoted mother, active church member, and well-liked employee who had no enemies and no involvement with criminal activity. Her murder seemed random and senseless, which made it even more terrifying to the public. Police faced enormous pressure to solve the case quickly. The media demanded answers. Linda's family pleaded for justice. Local politicians promised swift action. Detective Martin Devlin, the lead investigator, knew that his department's reputation depended on finding Linda's killer before fear paralyzed the entire community. The investigation initially focused on the shopping center where Linda's car was found. Security cameras were primitive in 1981, providing grainy black-and-white footage that revealed little useful information. Witnesses were interviewed, but their descriptions of suspicious individuals varied wildly. Physical evidence from the crime scene was limited. This was decades before DNA testing became standard practice in criminal investigations. As weeks passed without an arrest, the pressure on police intensified. The case was featured on local news broadcasts every night. Reward money was offered by Linda's family and local businesses. Tips poured into the police department, but none led to solid leads. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and public scrutiny that Nick Yarris first came to the attention of investigators. Nicholas James Yarris was born in 1961 in Philadelphia, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Irish Catholic family. His father, Frank, was a machinist who struggled with alcoholism and periodic unemployment. His mother, Marie, worked as a waitress to supplement the family's income and tried to hold the household together despite the chaos that Frank's drinking created. Nick's childhood was marked by instability and violence. Frank Yarris was a mean drunk who took out his frustrations on his wife and children through verbal and physical abuse. The family moved frequently, always staying one step ahead of eviction notices and unpaid bills. Nick learned early that the world was an unpredictable and often cruel place where survival required street smarts and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. By his teenage years, Nick had developed a reputation as a troublemaker. He was intelligent but unfocused, charming but unreliable. He dropped out of high school at 16 and began supporting himself through a series of petty crimes: shoplifting, burglary, car theft. Nothing violent, nothing that hurt innocent people, but enough to bring him to the attention of local police and establish him as a familiar face in the criminal justice system. Nick's criminal record was extensive but relatively minor. He had been arrested dozens of times for theft, possession of stolen property, and driving without a license. He had served short sentences in county jail and had been on probation almost continuously since turning 18. To police, Nick Yarris represented a certain type of criminal, a career petty offender who was always involved in something but never seemed to graduate to more serious crimes. This background made Nick an easy target when police needed someone to blame for Linda Craig's murder. The connection began with a traffic stop on January 3, 1982, about 3 weeks after Linda's body was found. Nick was driving a stolen car when he was pulled over by Pennsylvania State Police. During the stop, Nick attempted to run and was caught after a brief chase. While processing his arrest, officers discovered that Nick had been in the area around the time of Linda Craig's murder. This geographic connection, tenuous as it was enough to make Nick a person of interest in the homicide investigation. Detective Devlin interviewed Nick about his whereabouts on the night of December 15th, and Nick's story changed several times during the questioning. This inconsistency, combined with his criminal record and presence in the area, made Nick appear guilty to investigators who were under enormous pressure to solve the case. But the evidence against Nick was entirely circumstantial. There were no witnesses who could place him with Linda Craig. No physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. His fingerprints weren't found on Linda's car or personal belongings. There was nothing concrete linking Nick to the murder beyond the fact that he was a known criminal who had been in the general area at the relevant time. In a different era, with less pressure and better investigative techniques, this lack of evidence might have led police to continue searching for the real killer. Instead, Detective Devlin decided that Nick Yarris was guilty and began building a case around that assumption. The investigation that followed was a textbook example of how confirmation bias can corrupt the pursuit of justice. Instead of following evidence to a conclusion, investigators started with their conclusion and looked for evidence to support it. Witnesses who couldn't identify Nick were discouraged from testifying. Evidence that might have pointed to other suspects was ignored or minimized. Police focused exclusively on proving Nick's guilt rather than determining the truth. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the testimony of jailhouse informants, fellow criminals who claimed that Nick had confessed to them while in custody awaiting trial. These informants had powerful incentives to lie, reduce sentences, drop charges, and other considerations that made their testimony inherently unreliable. Nick's court-appointed attorney was overwhelmed and underprepared. Public defenders in the early 1980s handled enormous caseloads and had minimal resources for investigating complex cases. Nick's lawyer did little to challenge the prosecution's evidence or present alternative theories of the crime. The defense that was presented was perfunctory and ineffective. The trial lasted only 5 days. Nick testified in his own defense, maintaining his innocence and providing alibis for his whereabouts on the night of Linda's murder. But his criminal record and the testimony of the jailhouse informants made it easy for jurors to believe that he was capable of the brutal crime. On July 2, 1982, Nick Yarris was convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and kidnapping in the death of Linda Mae Craig. 2 days later, he was sentenced to death. At 20 years old, Nick became one of the youngest people on Pennsylvania's death row. The reality of his situation didn't fully hit Nick until he was processed into the State Correctional Institution at Huntingdon, home to Pennsylvania's death row. He was assigned to a 6 by 10-foot cell that would be his home for what everyone expected would be a relatively short time before his execution. Death row in the early 1980s was a place of perpetual despair. Inmates were locked in their cells for 23 hours per day, allowed out only for showers and brief exercise periods. There were no televisions, limited reading materials, and virtually no human contact beyond the guards who delivered meals and conducted counts. Nick's first months on death row were marked by denial and rage. He couldn't believe that he had been convicted of a crime he didn't commit based on such flimsy evidence. He wrote letters to newspapers, contacted civil rights organizations, and filed appeal after appeal, certain that someone would recognize the injustice and correct the mistake. But the appeals process moved slowly, and each rejection was more devastating than the last. Nick's direct appeals were denied by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. His petition for review by the U.S. Supreme Court was rejected without comment. His habeas corpus petition in federal court was dismissed. With each legal defeat, the reality of his situation became clearer. He was going to die for a crime he didn't commit, and the system didn't care. The psychological toll of life on death row was enormous. Nick watched fellow inmates lose their minds from isolation and despair. He witnessed men being taken away for execution and never returning. He lived with the constant knowledge that he could be next, that guards could come for him at any moment with news that his appeals had been exhausted and his execution date had been set. To survive mentally, Nick developed routines and coping mechanisms. He read voraciously, consuming every book the prison library could provide. He wrote constantly, letters to family, journals documenting his experiences, poetry that expressed emotions too complex for ordinary language. He exercised obsessively in his cell, doing push-ups and sit-ups to maintain physical strength and mental discipline. Most importantly, Nick refused to give up hope that the truth would eventually emerge. He studied law books, researching legal precedents and constitutional principles that might apply to his case. He wrote to journalists, investigators, and attorneys, searching for someone who might be willing to take a fresh look at the evidence against him. Years passed with agonizing slowness. Nick's mother died while he was on death row, and he was denied permission to attend her funeral. His siblings gradually stopped visiting, worn down by the emotional strain of maintaining relationships with someone they believed would eventually be executed. Nick felt increasingly isolated from the outside world, connected to life only through letters and the occasional phone call. But Nick's persistence in maintaining his innocence began to attract attention from unexpected sources. In 1988, he was contacted by Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck, attorneys who were pioneering the use of DNA testing to prove the innocence of wrongly convicted prisoners. They had read about Nick's case and were intrigued by the lack of physical evidence linking him to Linda Craig's murder. DNA testing was still in its infancy in the late 1980s. The technology existed, but it was expensive, time-consuming, and not yet widely accepted by courts. Neufeld and Scheck were part of a small group of attorneys and scientists who believed that DNA analysis could revolutionize criminal justice by providing definitive proof of guilt or innocence in cases where biological evidence was available. The problem with Nick's case was that biological evidence from Linda Craig's murder had been stored improperly and had degraded significantly during the years since the crime. Multiple attempts to extract usable DNA samples failed due to contamination and deterioration of the evidence. Nick spent the entire decade of the 1990s fighting for more sophisticated DNA testing while simultaneously battling the state's efforts to execute him. Pennsylvania resumed carrying out death sentences in 1995 after a long moratorium, and Nick received several execution dates that were stayed only at the last minute as his attorneys filed emergency appeals. The closest Nick came to execution was in 1999, when he was moved to a holding cell near the death chamber and given his last meal. He had said goodbye to his family and made peace with what he believed was his fate. Then, just hours before his scheduled execution, a federal judge granted a stay to allow for additional DNA testing using newer, more sensitive techniques. The breakthrough finally came in 2003. Dr. Edward Blake, a forensic scientist in California, was able to extract DNA from evidence that previous tests had deemed unusable. The results were unambiguous. The DNA found on Linda Craig's body did not match Nick Yarris. More importantly, the DNA profile matched samples from a convicted rapist who had been active in the Delaware County area during the time of Linda's murder. On January 16, 2004, after spending 8,057 days on death row, Nick Yarris walked out of prison as a free man. Pennsylvania authorities dropped all charges against him and issued a formal apology for the wrongful conviction. Nick was 42 years old and had spent more than half his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. The world Nick entered in 2004 was radically different from the one he had left in 1982. Cell phones were ubiquitous. The internet had transformed communication and commerce. Social media was beginning to change how people interacted with each other. Nick felt like Rip Van Winkle, awakening after decades to find that everything familiar had changed beyond recognition. The practical challenges of reintegrating into society were enormous. Nick had no current identification, no credit history, no job skills that were relevant to the modern economy. He had difficulty using ATMs, operating computers, and navigating the basic transactions of daily life that most people took for granted. But the psychological challenges were even greater. Nick had spent his entire adult life in an environment of rigid routine and constant supervision. Freedom felt overwhelming and sometimes frightening. He experienced anxiety attacks in crowded spaces and had difficulty trusting people or forming relationships. Pennsylvania compensated Nick for his wrongful conviction, but no amount of money could restore the years that had been stolen from him. He had missed his mother's funeral, lost contact with most of his family, and never had the opportunity to build a career, start a family, or experience the normal milestones of adult life. Instead of succumbing to bitterness and rage, Nick chose to transform his traumatic experience into a force for positive change. He wrote books about his experience on death row, documenting not just the legal injustice but the human cost of wrongful convictions. His memoir, The Fear of 13, became a bestseller and was adapted into a critically acclaimed documentary film. Nick became a powerful advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at law schools, conferences, and legislative hearings about the flaws in the system that had nearly cost him his life. He worked with organizations like the Innocence Project to help other wrongly convicted prisoners and to promote policies that would prevent future wrongful convictions. His advocacy focused particularly on the unreliability of eyewitness testimony and the dangers of prosecutorial misconduct. Nick's case exemplified how pressure to solve high-profile crimes could lead to tunnel vision and the conviction of innocent people when evidence was ambiguous or non-existent. Nick also worked to reform conditions on death row, arguing that prolonged isolation and the psychological torture of living under a death sentence constituted cruel and unusual punishment regardless of whether the condemned prisoner was actually guilty. His descriptions of life on death row provided graphic testimony about the dehumanizing effects of the death penalty system. Perhaps most remarkably, Nick refused to harbor hatred toward the people who had wrongfully convicted him. He recognized that Detective Devlin, the prosecutors, and even the jailhouse informants were products of a flawed system rather than evil individuals. His focus remained on changing the system rather than seeking revenge against the people who had operated within it. "I could spend the rest of my life being angry about what happened to me," Nick said in a 2010 interview. "But anger would just create another prison, and I've spent enough time behind bars. I choose to use my experience to help other people and to try to prevent this from happening to anyone else." Nick's story became part of a growing body of evidence about the fallibility of the criminal justice system. By 2024, over 190 people on death row in the United States had been exonerated and released, proving that the system was capable of condemning innocent people to death. Nick's case was among the most dramatic because of the length of time he spent on death row and the strength of the DNA evidence that ultimately proved his innocence. The real killer of Mae Craig was never brought to justice. The DNA evidence pointed to a suspect who died in prison while serving time for other crimes, taking with him any possibility of finally solving Linda's murder. Her family found some comfort in knowing that Nick was innocent, but their quest for justice remained unfulfilled. Nick's relationship with Linda's family was complicated. Some members initially struggled to accept his innocence, having believed for decades that her killer had been caught and punished. Others expressed regret that Nick had suffered for their tragedy and supported his advocacy work. All of them shared the frustration that Linda's real killer had escaped justice. As of 2024, Nick Yarris continues his work as an advocate and author. He has testified before Congress about wrongful convictions and has spoken at universities around the world about criminal justice reform. His story has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and academic studies examining the causes and consequences of wrongful convictions. Nick has also worked to rebuild personal relationships and create the family life that was denied to him during his decades in prison. He married and had children, experiencing for the first time the joys and responsibilities of parenthood. These personal milestones, taken for granted by most people, held special significance for someone who had expected to die alone in a prison cell. The passage of time has given Nick perspective on his experience that wasn't possible during the years he spent fighting for his freedom. He recognizes that his story, while tragic, also demonstrates the power of perseverance and the importance of never surrendering hope even in the darkest circumstances. "Death row taught me that hope isn't just an emotion," Nick reflected in his most recent book. "Hope is a decision. Every day I had to decide whether to believe that justice would eventually prevail or to give up and accept that I would die for someone else's crime. Choosing hope, even when it seemed irrational, kept me alive long enough for the truth to emerge. Nick's story also illustrates how technological advances can serve justice in ways that were impossible in earlier eras. DNA testing, which didn't exist when he was convicted, ultimately proved his innocence and freed him from death row. His case demonstrates both the fallibility of traditional investigative techniques and the power of science to correct past mistakes. The Nick Yarris who walked out of prison in 2004 was a different person than the young man who had entered in 1982. 22 years of facing death had given him a profound appreciation for life and a deep understanding of human nature that could only come from extreme adversity. He had lost more than 2 decades, but he had gained wisdom and perspective that enabled him to transform his suffering into a force for positive change. Today, Nick Yarris stands as living proof that the human spirit can endure almost unimaginable hardship and emerge not just intact, but stronger. His journey from death row to freedom serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of a flawed justice system and an inspiring testament to the power of hope to sustain us through our darkest hours. The 8,057 days Nick spent on death row are a permanent reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. But they also represent 8,057 opportunities to give up that he chose not to take. In the end, his refusal to surrender hope didn't just save his own life. It created a legacy that continues to protect the innocent and reform a system that nearly killed the wrong man.